We're bringing you boots on the ground insight from the ranchers, conservationists, and partners who are helping to preserve the best of the Golden State for generations to come. Join the California Rangeland Trust for inspiring stories of resilience, innovation, and hope as we get tuned into the land.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tune Into the Land. I'm your host and CEO of the California Rangeland Trust, Michael Delbar. Around here, we like to say every day is Earth Day on ranches. The work happening out there on the land through grazing, stewardship, and conservation is quietly benefiting ecosystems, wildlife, and even the climate. That's why, in honor of Earth Day, I'm excited to bring to you today's conversation. We're joined by someone who's not only passionate about the planet, but also committed to setting the record straight when it comes to animal agriculture and the effects it has on changing climate. Dr. Frank Mitloehner, also known as the greenhouse gas guru, is a professor and air quality specialist at UC Davis and the director of the Clear Center. Through his research, Dr. Mitloehner is helping ranchers, policymakers, and the public better understand how livestock really impacts the environment and how, with the right practices, they can actually be part of the climate solution. So with that, here's my interview with Dr. Frank Mitloehner. Today I'm here with Dr. Frank Mitloehner, the greenhouse gas guru, to dig into the science and truths behind animal agriculture's methane emissions and more. Dr. Mitloehner, thank you for being with us today. Appreciate that. Why don't you share a little bit about your history, how you came from Germany to Davis, your academic background. Tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Yeah, so I spent half of my life, the first half, in the old country in Germany, where I grew up, near the Dutch border on the very western side. After the wall came down in Germany, I moved to the eastern part, and that's where I studied agricultural engineering. So I was there for 5 years at Leipzig University, and then decided I wanted to learn more about beef, raised American style. And so I went to Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And I did my PhD there. And I studied the environmental management of beef and spent 5 years there. They made me eat some big steaks, by the way. Some very big steaks, I might say.
That's too bad.
Yeah, I didn't know what an ounce was. I learned it fast. And then I moved from Lubbock, Texas to Davis, California. And that was 23 years ago when I started my first ever real job as a professor and air quality specialist here in the animal science department at UC Davis. I've been here ever since. And for the last 6 years, I'm also the director of the Clear Center, which is a center that focuses around stewardship. Some people call it sustainability of animal agriculture. So we look at environmental issues, we look at animal welfare and health issues, we look at worker issues, and so forth around animal agriculture. And it's been a good ride.
How long has the Clear Center been in existence?
6 years.
So 6 years, okay. And you were instrumental in founding that, I believe.
I'm the director and I'm the founder of it.
You have a social media nickname as the Greenhouse Gas Guru. That's pretty cool. How did you develop that name? How'd that come about?
So by training, I'm an air quality specialist, and I was hired here 23 years ago in the animal science department as the first air quality specialist in any animal science department in the United States. At that time, anything air and livestock was a laughing matter. Okay, so people just snickered around, thought, how ludicrous is that? Today, I don't think many people will snicker on this anymore because now they understand methane, ammonia, and other things are a big deal for the industry, one that we seek to control. And so I'm specialized in the impact animal agriculture has on the air environment. So and that includes particles like dust particles. It includes odors. It includes gases that are regulated like methane or ammonia or hydrogen sulfide, and ways to minimize those emissions from animal agriculture.
Cows, animal agriculture, but cows in particular, get a bad rap. There are a lot of folks that would love to see animal agriculture go away, and maybe some of the new synthetic or artificial or fake meats and fake proteins or alternative proteins take its place. Myriad reasons, but that's their goal. And like I said, cows get the bad rap. Can you explain a little bit about some of that misinformation you see out there? What are some of those myths that you have to combat every day?
So first of all, within animal agriculture, it's not pigs or poultry, but it's ruminant livestock that have the bad rap. And the reason why they have the bad rap is because they're ruminants. And that means they can eat stuff nobody else can. And when they digest it, there are microbes in their digestive tract that can break it down. And this is really a miracle of nature, because this whole thing is powered by the sun. The sun grows forages. That cellulose that grows in the form of grasses is not digestible by anybody else but ruminant animals. I want to emphasize it because it's that important. The only animals in the world that can digest cellulose and make something that humans can eat from it are ruminant livestock. And why is that important? It's important because cellulose, that's the carbohydrate in the grasses, is the world's most abundant biomass. Nothing in the world that's alive is more abundant than cellulose. Think about the significance of that. And the only livestock that can make use of it and convert it into animal source foods such as milk, dairy, and other products are our ruminant four-legged friends. So this is really important. And the reason why it's so important is because the majority of farmland in the United States and globally only grows cellulose-containing forages. You cannot grow crops there, like nuts or vegetables, fruit, and so forth. What grows there are grasses. And the only ones utilizing those grasses are your cattle, sheep, and goats. So the bad rap is really, I would say, at least misinformed, maybe also intentionally so by some, because the people who have the greatest beef with beef and other ruminant livestock are those who always were in that camp. Okay, originally they came from a different angle, an angle of animal welfare, animal rights, ethical treatment, the fact that they resemble that we actually kill those animals at the end of their lives to eat them. That's really the problem they have with it, okay?
Right.
So, and after they realized that the public was okay with the fact that if animals have an okay life, at some point they will be killed and eaten. The vast majority of people is okay with that. And so that talking point didn't resonate. But then the whole climate narrative came around, and that was one point that stuck to the consumers. So now, particularly the high school age kids, as well as college students and so on, asked, what can I do as an individual to minimize my environmental footprint, in particular, my carbon footprint via the food that I buy and eat? And then those same people, those activist individuals that tried to get rid of animal agriculture before for ethical reasons, said, well, yeah, I mean, they produce a lot of methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So if we get rid of livestock, then we no longer produce that methane, and then we have a short-term solution to our global warming problem. That's the angle that they took. Now, as you can tell by the length of my answer, this whole thing is loaded and it's complicated because there is some truth to it. Okay, I'm not saying they are wrong entirely. It is true that ruminant livestock produces methane. And it's also true that this methane is more potent in trapping heat from the sun than carbon dioxide is, a gas that comes when you burn fossil fuels. In fact, it's 28 times more potent per molecule of gas, methane is, than CO2. So we would now assume that, well, if we just eat something else, then everything goes away, right? Let's just eat plant-based alternatives to meat, let's say plant-based burgers or so. And that was tried. The public heard it so often that people really got tired of it. Namely, the fact that they were told, eat a plant-based burger and your impact on warming is grossly reduced. And or if we as society were to go vegetarian or even vegan, then that would have a massive impact on our climate. Here's what I can tell you for sure. the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, not everybody's friend, but that's the agency we have that quantifies the impact of society on the environment, assigns a total greenhouse gas footprint to animal agriculture at the magnitude of 4%. That means 4% of all greenhouse gases causing global warming in the United States are from livestock. And that's beef and dairy, it's sheep, it's goats, it's chicken, the whole enchilada, okay? 4% of all greenhouse gases in the United States comes from livestock, according to the EPA. If we were to go meatless Monday, 1 day less meat per week, then that would reduce the carbon footprint of the United States by 0.3%. Some people would say that's not very much, and other people would say that's huge. It's up to you to decide whether it's very much or not, but that's how much it would be. If we as a nation, in a theoretical exercise, if we as a nation were to stop eating animal source foods, no more meat, no more dairy, no more eggs, no more animal source foods, then that would reduce the carbon footprint of the United States by 2.6%. So what I'm telling you is this: the narrative of livestock killing our climate, of us having to focus on livestock and the food we consume in order to help us from a changing climate, is ill-advised, it's ill-informed, and it's not constructive because it takes away the eye on the prize. The eye on the prize is that we need to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels, which by far are the main contributor to greenhouse gases, namely CO2 in particular. Now, livestock plays a role, and we have to play that role of reducing it in our sector. And we do this here at the university, and you do it on the rangeland. But it's ill-advised to say, well, you are the big 800-pound gorilla. As long as we focus on you, the problem goes away. It doesn't.
Well, you also have the impact of, if we did eliminate animal proteins, quit eating those, the other impacts to the environment from not grazing those grasses on lands that, again, as you said, don't produce edible plants for humans. Those are grasses that are there, can only be consumed by these ruminants. If we lose that, then we've lost that management of those lands. And that has a very large negative impact to the environment that isn't part of that equation in some of those minds.
Well, we live in a world where people are largely disconnected from knowing where their food comes from. They literally associate the supermarket where they buy it from with it being the source. But that's not the source, as you and I know very well. But farmers and ranchers are the source of that food. And most of those people with these preconceived notions have never set foot on a farm or ranch. That is just fact, okay? And I teach classes here with 400, 500, 600 students. I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And these are students in animal science who you think would know more than the rest of society, who know shockingly little when they come into college. Shockingly little. Like, is yogurt made of something else, or is it just like Coca-Cola made in a factory? I mean, the link between milk and yogurt is not clear to many. Think about that. That's pretty bad. So here in my office, I have a map showing California. It's right behind you. And this map shows a vast area that's entirely rangeland, okay? And that's about half of the state. But half of the state is rangeland. And so if we say, let's just get rid of livestock and let nature grow and do its thing. Well, I have observed this in this almost quarter century that I've been in California. I have observed what happens if you let nature just do its thing in areas that were strongly manipulated by humans over the last few decades. And we see it every year where vast areas of this state go up in flames. Vast areas. The size of the island of Maui burns in California every year. Think about that.
And what's the environmental impact of that?
The environmental impact is massive because what's burning there is carbon-containing plant materials. And all that carbon that those plants had assimilated and sequestered is now going up in flames. Think about last year, They had these wildfires in Canada. And in 1 year, due to their wildfires, so much carbon got re-released into the atmosphere as was mitigated in the 10 years prior in the entire country of Canada. In 1 year, it all went into the atmosphere. We do not want to do that, okay? We have to think about the cyclical nature of animals and plants and soils and how that needs to be managed. And who can manage it best? I assure you, I know who can manage it best because I visit these people with my classes. I know these people who understand the soil quality, the soil microbiology, what grows on it, valuable forages versus weeds. They know the fire ecology of those lands. They understand what animals need to put onto that land, exerting what kind of grazing pressure in order to keep the fuel load down. And when I say fuel load, I mean fuel load, because this biomass can go up in flame, and it will go up in flames if we don't manage it. So leave it to those ranchers that we have in the state, and that land will be taken care of.
Now, that's a good point. Research done at UC Berkeley by Dr. Lynn Hunsinger, and I know you know Dr. Hunsinger, determined that cattle by grazing remove 12 billion pounds of dry mass every year in California. And it's funny how we see folks that are opposed to grazing management on public lands, Forest Service, BLM, state lands, and they don't like to see timber management on those same lands. But lack of management of our resources. Take human management out of there, and then we get those fires. And as you stated very clearly in the Canadian fire, all of that progress, all those programs where we're trying to sequester carbon and maintain that is gone up in smoke, literally. It amazes me sometimes how folks can't put that together.
Well, the people who can't put that together should do a field trip like I did recently with my 10-year-old son, where I took him from Visalia into the Sequoia National Park, one of the greatest jewels we have in the United States, 3,000-year-old sequoia trees. Those people who don't believe what you just said should do a little trip and make that road trip from Visalia to the Sequoia National Park. And they will drive through tens of kilometers of areas that are completely burned. They are charcoaled, okay? If they still don't believe what you say, they can come and visit me here in Davis, and we do a little trip to Napa. The entire area from Davis to Napa burned down. All these hills burned down. There's not a single tree standing. And any kind of housing that was in between is gone. So if people doubt that we need land management, then they need to do a little bit driving around, and that will open their eyes, I hope.
You talk about methane levels now and trying to reduce those, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But how is that level today compared to historical levels? We're producing more animal protein per animal today than we were decades ago. Our efficiency's gone up. But what's that level of atmospheric methane over time? Is it increased? Has it decreased? Does it remain steady?
Yeah, so there are different answers to that question, okay, depending upon what time horizon we choose. I first give you a long time horizon. So 250 years ago, the time before the European settlers came to the United States, there were 60 million bison in the United States and 40 million large antelope. So approximately 100 million large ruminants. Today, most of those are gone, but we still have 90 million beef and about 9 million dairy cows. So that's approximately 100 million large ruminants again. Now domesticated, no more, wild, but an equal number of large ruminants populate the United States today as did 250 years ago. And that means the total amount of methane those animals belched and produced via manure and so on is roughly the same. And while that appeals to our common sense as an argument as to that not being an additional emission source, from a regulatory perspective, it plays no role. The Environmental Protection Agency and others do not care about what happened hundreds of years ago with wild populations. What they care about is emissions associated with human activity today. And that's not wildlife, and that's not volcanoes, and that's not oceans. It is human activity that they can regulate, and that they will regulate, and that we have to manage, okay? So from a intellectual curiosity perspective, not much has changed on methane 250 versus today from ruminant livestock or from ruminants in general. If we now go back a few decades ago, let's say the 1970s, so roughly the time when I was born, in the United States, we had approximately 50 million more beef cattle than today. 50 million more than today. But with this much larger crop, we produced the same amount of beef as we do today. We have never produced more beef per animal, or however, whatever you want to put into the denominator, than we do today. On the US level, we are producing, or even more global, we are producing 18% of the global beef here in the United States, with 6% of the global beef herd. 18% of the global beef is produced by our ranchers in the United States and by our feedlots. 18% by only 6% of the global beef herd, which is the beef herd we have here. And that is astounding. And if you talk to people in my field, many of them, by the way, not very much aware of animal agriculture or agriculture in general at all, but when they just hear that, they will tell you we should produce food at those places in the world that are most suitable to producing it. Okay? So if you want to produce avocados or tomatoes or something, then you might want to do that in California. And you might not want to do that in the Midwest, where you have to have huge greenhouses to do it. It's not that they can't do it. They can do it in greenhouses. But if you have the ideal growing conditions here, why wouldn't you do it here? Equally, we shouldn't grow corn and soy here in California because there are better places in the Midwest. But when you talk to people at a more global scale, they will tell you one of the biggest problems with agriculture today in the world is not those areas that are intensive and that are efficient, like the United States, whether it's on rangeland or whether it's in feedlots and other places. But the biggest challenge are developing countries. And please do not get this as me finger pointing away from us toward other places. But when you look at the total picture of livestock's impact on the environment globally, then 80% of these impacts of livestock on the environment occur in developing countries. 80%. Does that number come from Frank Mitloehner? No, it comes from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. 80% of global livestock emissions are associated with livestock in developing countries, and 20% in developed countries. Again, this is not a finger pointing, but the reason why this is important to point out is because we know what could be done in countries like, let's say, India or in African countries to improve productivity so that the herds could be smaller. Because right now the herds are immense. They are huge. I'll give you one example. India and Brazil, these two countries, have more cattle than the rest of the world combined.
Wow.
So, for example, in the United States, we have 9 million dairy cows, 9 million. In India, they have 300 million. They could produce the same amount of milk as they do today with 1/10 of their current herd, if they were able to keep parasites low, nutrition high, other health issues low, and so on. Better genetics, better crop production. We know how to do it, but there's a lack of international cooperation getting it done. So if you really want to make a big dent in livestock emissions globally, you're not looking here. You're looking at the wrong spot when you look here. That's not to say we shouldn't do our part. Okay, we should do our part. But the big dent will be made in other places of the world, not here.
So the UN's FAO came out with livestock's long shadow a number of years ago. And that got a lot of play in the media. Again, livestock being the bad guy. you found a critical error in their calculations. They had 18% of gases attributed to agriculture. Can you talk about what you saw in that report and what you did to change that?
Yeah, so I have quite a history with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. Back in 2006, this report, Livestock's Long Shadow, came out. It said that globally, 18% of greenhouse gas emissions stem from the livestock sector. Globally, 18%. And they added that this 18% from livestock is greater than the contributions of the global transportation sector. And what that means, if you want to break it down, is that cows and pigs and sheep and chicken produce more greenhouse gases leading to climate change than all cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships in the world combined. And if this sounds fishy to you, it did to us. And as scientists, we can't just say it doesn't sound right. We have to prove or disprove a certain assertion. And we found that there was a mistake in both the number of 18% as well as the comparison of livestock to transportation. The number of 18% I felt was inflated, and I felt it should be closer to 10%. And that's global contribution of livestock to climate, not US. And that's an important distinction. So I said it's closer to 10. And secondly, we found that when they compared livestock to transportation, they used two different methodologies. For livestock, they used a methodology that I think is appropriate. It's called a life cycle assessment, where you look at all contributions of a pound of meat or a gallon of milk or so onto climate, on water quality, air quality, and so on. From cradle to grave. That's why it's called a life cycle assessment. So they look at soil emissions, crop emissions, animal emissions, front and back end manure, the whole thing. Then processing the animals, getting them to the market, you buying them in the supermarket, cooking them at home, putting it in your mouth, and that's the end of that product. That's the grave, okay? So they looked at the life cycle assessment of these products, and that's the way it should be done. And they did it for livestock, and they did it well. But they didn't do the same thing for transportation. They didn't look into the life cycle of cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, roads, harbors, airports, but only tailpipe emissions of these vehicles. Only what comes out the tailpipe, okay? And then they compared livestock's life cycle emissions to transportation's direct emissions through the tailpipe. And I pointed that out in a peer-reviewed publication. They agreed with my criticism and they corrected it. In the years thereafter, my work with the FAO continued in a very different way. I became the chairman of a global partnership project called LEAP, Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance Partnership, it's called. It's a global FAO-hosted partnership of scientists that developed the guidelines on how to measure air quality, water quality, climate impacts, biodiversity, and so on from all livestock in the world. There were 300 scientists who worked on this LEAP project, and I was the chairman of that project, which is kind of interesting considering that I was one of the greatest critics originally. Then I became one of the figureheads within this partnership agreement. And that was very productive.
Well, that was a critical role to play. And I think that says a lot about you as an individual, but being able to take that on and show the fallacies of the original Livestock's Long Shadow, which still to this day amazes me, still gets played. And being able to refute that and now being a vested part of that, I think says a lot about the quality of the work and what it's doing.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody was ill-intended, okay? I don't think anybody meant to do harm. But sometimes when you come up with flashy comparisons, you have to be very careful because there's a good chance if something that sounds fishy is fishy.
You have an analogy that you use a lot in regard to greenhouse gases, I think methane in particular, the bathtub. Can you kind of explain that analogy and how those levels aren't changing and the inflow, the outflow?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated to explain how methane differs from, let's say, carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide, first of all, is largely the product of burning oil, coal, gas with our cars, trucks, trains, power plants, and so on. Okay, every time we burn fossil fuels, we put CO2 into the atmosphere. That CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years or longer, pretty much forever. Every time you've ever burned oil, coal, or gas, or diesel or something, every time you've ever done that in your entire life, you produce CO2, and all of that is still in the atmosphere. And all of the ones that your parents and grandparents and so on put in is still in the atmosphere as well. So that's the big conundrum humanity is in, okay? We all do it, okay? I'm not pointing fingers at anybody else. I'm just saying that's a fact, okay? Every time we burn that stuff, we put carbon that came out of the ground where it was stored for a very, very long time, because that was plant and animal material a long time ago as well, right? Coal and so on. We are taking it out of the ground, we are burning it, and then we put that carbon that was down there for so long into the atmosphere. And that's additional carbon in the atmosphere causing additional warming. Regardless of whether you burn a little bit or a lot, you put additional warming into the air. That's one fact, okay? So now the question is, how about methane? Methane per molecule traps the heat much better than CO2. So per molecule, methane is more potent than CO2. Just like a glass of vodka is more potent than a glass of beer in getting you a buzz. Methane is more potent than CO2 in trapping heat from the sun. But luckily, methane is different from CO2 insofar that it's not just produced by sources such as swamps or landfills or rice paddies or cow belches, but methane is also naturally destroyed. There's a process in the atmosphere that destroys that gas. It's called oxidation. And what does it are so-called radicals, hydroxyl radicals to be precise. They destroy the methane, and that takes approximately a decade to happen. And then that methane that was produced a decade earlier is gone. So in other words, any time that you have ever burned fossil fuels with your vehicles and so on, that stuff is all in the air warming the planet. But if your cows produced methane 10 years ago, then that methane that was produced 10 years ago is now gone and has since been replaced by those same cows with fresh methane. But it's not, if you have a constant herd of cattle, then an equal amount of what's produced is also being destroyed. And so a constant source of methane is not the problem. If we increase methane over time, that's a problem, because per molecule it's very heat trapping. Now we come to the bathtub. So remember, methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. It doesn't just have sources, it also has sinks. CO2 only has sources, no sinks. Okay? So here comes the analogy. Imagine two bathtubs. The first is a bathtub analogy for CO2, and then that's followed by a bathtub analogy for methane. The bathtub analogy for CO2 is one where you have a bathtub with a faucet, but the bathtub has no drain. And every time you crank up the faucet on low, medium, or high, you add water to the bathtub and the water levels rise. They can only rise, they can never go down because there is no drain. And that's what CO2 does to our climate. Every time we burn fossil fuel, we add additional warming to our planet. So that's the bathtub analogy for CO2, only a faucet, but no drain. Now comes the bathtub analogy for methane. Here we have a faucet and we have a drain. The drain stands for the fact that methane has sinks, that there are things that destroy methane. So that analogy works the following way. You have a faucet, and if you turn that faucet on normal, then an equal amount of water that goes into the bathtub is let gone off through the drain. And that means the water level stays stable. It doesn't go up or down. If we reduce the water inflow, put the faucet on low, then we put less water into the bathtub than the drain lets go of. What happens then? the levels go down. The water levels go down. And that's where we ideally want to be with methane, okay? What happens if you crank that faucet up all the way? Then we have a problem, because then you add more water to the bathtub than the drain will let go of. And then we have a problem. And that happens particularly in developing countries, where a growing demand for animal source foods means they are growing herds. That means more and more methane is produced year after year after year. And that means more warming. And that's what's happening globally. But as I said, in developing countries, not in countries like the US or European countries.
How do you communicate the results of all your work to different audiences, whether it be policymakers, students, general public? It's great work, it's great information, but with all the misinformation out there, how do you communicate the reality to these audiences?
So there are many different platforms. So we are not just active here in California or in the United States, but also internationally. And so often enough, by the end of this month, for example, I'll be in New Zealand and Australia, and I will meet with policymakers. I'll meet with agency folks. I'll meet with climate change commissioners of these respective countries. I often enough meet with parliamentarians, not just in Australia, New Zealand, but in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Uruguay, and so on. Why? Because they all have a livestock sector that's significant, and they want to make sure that they don't make mistakes that you can't undo. Because once you get rid of your farming sector, and once these people say, we've got enough of this, they're not coming back. And they're not telling their kids to go back, but they're telling their kids to stay clear of the sector, okay? These countries have learned to understand that there's that risk of being too abrasive and too blunt in their approaches, that could lead farmers to just say, we are out of here. So my approach has always been, and will always be, that I'm coming from an angle of appreciation, okay? I appreciate the work our farmers and ranchers do. They are, to me, as important a sector as the health sector is. The health sector with doctors and nurses and so on, everybody hails them, thinks they are the world, they are super important, which they are. But guess what? The farmers producing our food are as important. They are the second most important strategic sector of any society. So work with these farmers and not against them is the message I have for any kind of public policy figure or agency person, okay? And then I explain to them the nature of agriculture, the nature of what they want to regulate or manage. And I understand that sector well. I understand the animal agricultural sector well. I've studied it in depth. I've worked in this sector for a long time. I'm well connected. Some people criticize me for that, by the way. Some people say my critics criticize me not for my science. They criticize me not for unethical behavior or so. They criticize me for the fact that I'm too close to agriculture. And you know what? That specific aspect of my work is my greatest feather in the cap. That I am trusted by the agricultural sector. They might not always agree with my findings, but they know I'm not BSing around. I'm giving it to them straight. I tell them and teach them what I have learned and how they can address challenges. And they appreciate that. They get it from me straight because they are straight shooters. And so my critics don't like that. And that's fine. They don't have to love me. That's totally fine. I'm absolutely happy with that. But so that's what we do with policymakers. And we do this internationally. We do it here in the US. I have had communications with Congress people. I have given testimony before the US Senate. I have talked to everybody up and down Sacramento about livestock and climate, livestock and the environment, and so on. Then there are other players like agencies, like the California Air Resources Board or the water boards or the California Energy Commission or so. They are important players in the state. And some of my former graduate students have gone to work in these agencies. And that's very important because there was a critical lack of agricultural expertise in these agencies before. By training people to become to have a PhD in this field and then go to work in an agency like that is actually a huge advantage.
Absolutely.
So obviously I am trusted in these agencies and they communicate a lot with me. Oftentimes research I do is research to which I invite agency members to partake in. So for example,
received?
Oh yeah. For example, I've done air quality research. I invited the California Air Resources Board to be part of it. They were. And then we published together. Why is that important? Why would your listeners here think that this is a good thing? That is a good thing because what comes out of that research automatically is accepted by the agencies that are dealing with it because they were part of it.
Their ownership.
Yes. So it's logical, but sometimes you have to explain it a little bit more in depth. And then last but not least, of course, we are communicating with the public at large. We are communicating with high school students, with college students, with the mom doing the shopping. We are communicating with chefs. We are communicating with judges. Last week, I spoke in front of 30 judges, California judges. Now, that was quite an experience, I might say. From county judges all the way to Supreme Court justices. Why? Because they wanted to know, how does the legislative work in California around livestock, in particular dairy, because that's such a big topic here, how is it accepted? How is it viewed by farmers and ranchers? What works? What doesn't work? Where can things be improved? And if you get to talk to people like judges who normally don't use the carrot approach of incentivizing you for good behavior, but who penalize you for bad behavior, call that the cane approach, and you tell them that the carrot approach can actually work and work very well, and that we should use the carrot approach because we need our farmers to stay in farming, then you'll be surprised what their reception of that was. It was surroundingly well, and I'm still receiving emails today.
That is good. You mentioned that your work with the ranchers and the farmers, how that's received. And sometimes the science is there, the facts are there. Sometimes that may not be what we want to hear, but they receive that well. So using that carrot approach in finding ways in which practices can be changed. If they make economic sense, they'll be embraced. If they don't make economic sense, there's no way to do those. What are some of those innovations that are out there now or coming down the line that can make economic sense and that the ranchers and farmers can embrace?
So there's an old saying, you can only be green if you're in the green. Okay? You cannot be green if you're in the red. And I think everybody out there will understand what that means, right? So we want to do the right thing. But if it's expensive and nobody covers the cost, but the farmer or rancher, it's not going to happen. The same is true for any industry out there, okay? If you are Apple or I don't know what company, Tesla or who knows who, and they are confronted with some serious cost issues, they will do anything they can to circumvent that. So any industry is trying to keep tabs on cost and keeping them low. And in agriculture, we are a sector that has low revenues, okay? And that's just not going to change. People are willing to pay a certain amount of their disposable income for food and not more.
And we're price takers.
Right.
We can't pass those costs on.
Right. So what are those different ways of reducing, let's say, climate impacts of animal agriculture? I'll give you some examples from the dairy industry. The dairy industry, because that's our biggest sector in California, contributing to greenhouse gases. The dairy industry is asked to reduce 40% of its methane. And they are asked to achieving that by the year 2030, so in 5 years from now. And that law, and it is a law that came down the pike a few years ago, made the dairy industry very worried at first because they thought, oh my gosh, this is unprecedented in the world, which it is. No other place in the world has ever asked farmers to reduce 40% methane. But they were happy to find out that the legislature had used an approach, namely the carrot approach rather than the cane approach, to incentivize ways that reduce emissions. For example, if a dairy that stores its manure in a lagoon caps the lagoon, the manure storage, and therefore now the gases don't just leave the manure storage, go into the air, but instead these gases are not trapped under a cover, then this so-called biogas that's trapped, by the way, 70% of which is methane, 70% of which is methane, then that biogas is cleaned up until at the end it's pure methane. And then that cleaned biogas is now called renewable natural gas, is going into the utility company pipeline and is used to run vehicle fleets, such as heavy-duty trucks, buses, and so on. The farm or whoever owns this digester, this covered lagoon, will receive credits for that gas that they produced. They're called low-carbon fuel standard credits. That's a mouthful. But it's a credit that historically was very high. Some 5 years ago, the credit farmers got for the sale of the biogas per cow. So 5 years ago, sale for the biogas per cow produced was approximately half of that they received for the milk they sold. So we're talking about some serious incentives there. Since then, the incentives have gone down, but it's still cost effective to do what I just said. The biogas that's produced is metered. Okay, before it leaves the farm, it's metered, so we know exactly how much each farm produces, and it's bought at a price by the state of California. So I would say in 5 years from now, we will have half of all cows, dairy cows in California, producing biogas that's then used for the vehicle fleets or for some industries that cannot be run by solar, wind, or other renewables. And in addition to manure digesters, there are other approaches. Some of them are feed additives. Okay, so we're not talking about every farmer now having to use a certain feed additive. Okay, we're not talking about that at all. But we're talking about a slew of different types of feed additives that make sense for some farmers. Some of those feed additives improve performance of animals. For example, feed efficiency or milk yield or components or other performance variables. So they make sense from an economic perspective and also reduce some of the methane that the animals would normally belch out. Other feed additives only reduce methane, and they do it at a much larger percent. Okay, so they are more effective. But they're also expensive. So the question then becomes, who will pay for it? Let's say a feedlot or a dairy uses a feed additive that reduces methane. That's costly. Who pays for it? The answer to that is that there's a market that's establishing. And that market has a price for carbon. Okay? And that price for carbon can amount to the price of the feed additive. Not that the farmer is making a lot of money with this, okay, but so that they don't incur additional cost. And the reason why this is probably going to happen is because many of those places that you sell your product to, the Walmart, the Sam's Club, the McDonald's, the Burger King, the Starbucks, the Nestle's, and so on, they all have net zero goals for their companies. And they will achieve those net zero goals. And that's independent of what's happening in Washington, D.C., who's president, who is in power, is not determining those goals that these companies have. They have their goals, and they will achieve them through working with their supply chains. And the supply chains for these companies are the farmers and ranchers. So that's a second approach, the feed additives. A third approach is, on the dairy side, we have found that methane is a heritable trait. The mama cow passes the methane on to her calf, or the potential to form methane, I should say. If a mama cow is a high methane producing animal, it's very likely that her daughter is also one. And there are now genomic tests that can tell you which animal is a high and which one is a low methane producing animal. And you can make selection decisions based on that. So in the future, it will not just be scrotal circumference or who knows what kind of genetic variable that's used for breeding decisions, but it might also be methane. And if it does become methane in the future, if that will become one of the selection criteria for breeding, then know this. You have replaced your herd, let's say in 5 or 10 years from now, with low methane producing animals, then that is a permanent solution for your place.
How's the efficiency and productivity of that cow that is a lower methane producer versus the one that's a higher methane? It has to be some difference in the digestive system.
Yeah, very important question. And of course, those colleagues who did the work on dairy, they were at the University of Guelph in Canada, by the way. They looked into, does a low methane producing cow produce less milk or have lower components or something else with respect to productivity?
It was a trade-off.
And they didn't find any differences other than the methane. They looked for all the variables with tens of thousands of animals and they didn't find them, which surprised me. And I tell you why it surprised me. Methane is nothing other than energy. If you cook with gas at home, or if you heat your home with gas, the gas you're using is methane. It's called natural gas. That meant natural gas is methane, okay? If you have a dairy and you have a lagoon and you just off-gas that gas into the air without a cover, then that means you're just losing all that energy that was in the manure to the air in the form of methane. Approximately 10% of the energy that we feed to ruminant livestock, 10% of that is belched out as methane. And that means energy bye-bye, gone, money gone too. Managing methane is not just something that makes you greener with respect to ecologically greener, but it's also something that can help you financially and therefore stay in the green. Because losses of methane are losses of energy, and losses of energy are losses of money. I want to change the way people think about methane, away from it being a problem, which it could be if you don't manage it, toward being part of a solution if you do manage it.
You have the State of the Science Summit coming up. Tell us what is behind that and what are some of the topics that are going to be presented at that Science Summit?
So the State of the Science Summit is an event that we do here at UC Davis. We have been doing it for 3 years already. We always have 300-400 people in attendance. And these people are the most interesting group that I have seen in my, I don't know how many decades of work, because we have the right people and the right mix of people in the room. We have people all the way from the United Nations FAO, the same organization we talked about before today. Yeah. They are there. We have several ministers of agriculture from throughout the world. Anywhere from New Zealand to Brazil to India and so on and so on. We have ministers attending that meeting. We have people with special expertise, let's say on the climate side, from different international commissions there. We have internationally highly regarded top scientists there. We have NGOs there, some of which are normally not very friendly toward animal agriculture, are there because they want to see what's happening. Is this just a bunch of greenwashing or creative accounting, or are these people serious? And I can assure you we are serious. This is not a bunch of foo-foo here. This is real, okay? And they find that, and they have found that in the past. And it's important that they are there. I'm happy they are there.
Yeah.
Of course, we have animal agriculture there. We have the beef, the dairy industry, and others. And this mixture of folks really takes a lot of this contentious atmosphere out of this discussion, okay? The we against them. Is there something fishy going on? Are they just trying to deflect of their responsibility in animal agriculture? Are they serious about reducing their impact? All of that. And the topics that I discussed are very broad. They are largely around reducing the carbon footprint of animal agriculture, okay, and helping farmers to understand what the contributions are, where they can make changes. And policymakers learn from one another what works and what doesn't. And I have made it my mission to explain to them, don't use the stick. Do not use the stick, okay? You first need to make sure that you yourself understand the subtleties around methane in particular. And again, I want to emphasize this gas is not something that's not a problem, and it can be a problem if we don't manage it. But if we do manage it, we can have a real dent in short-lived warming of our planet. And that's why I'm very passionate about addressing it. And they get that. And they invite me. Last year, I visited 26 countries throughout the world as a result of that.
You're on the road a lot.
I have been.
Wow. How can someone register for this?
The State of the Science Summit, if you just Google that at UC Davis, has, of course, a web address where you can register, and it's an easy process.
Dr. Mitloehner, this has been a great conversation. The information that you have shared with us, I hope will hit some folks and so they could understand what real science is out there. The misinformation, like we talked about, still amazes me that folks can't put what you and I would see is pretty logical and common sense together. And the work that you're doing with the Clear Center at UC Davis is amazing. And from the industry standpoint, like you said, sometimes it's not what maybe we don't want to hear, but it's there, and we respect that. And the work that you're doing has been a huge benefit for the industry. We thank you for that. And thank you for being part of this conversation today.
You are super welcome. And let me tell you this, what is very important to me is that players in the industry open up with the public about what they do. And I commend you for some of the work. For example, this documentary you recently did, because it shows that you care. It shows that you care for those people driving by your ranches, not just because they are the consumers of your products, but because you want them to know, look, we are not here doing something deceptive or something inhumane or so. We care for this land. We care for these animals. We care for the food that we produce, and we want to share it with you. Yes, we are private people, but we understand you have questions, and we are not shying away to answering those. So thank you for caring, and thank you for telling us that you do.
Well said. Thank you. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Mitloehner. The State of the Science Summit is on May 19th through the 21st at UC Davis. You can learn more and register at the link in the show notes. That closes the gate on another episode of Tune Into the Land. We want to remind you that your feedback matters. Share your thoughts by leaving a comment or a review. Let us know what you enjoyed, what topics you'd like us to dig into, and your suggestions for future guests. Don't forget to hit that follow button to ensure you're notified when new episodes drop. And if you'd like to support our mission, visit our website at rangelandtrust.org. There, you can make a donation or check out the Get Involved tab to learn more about upcoming events and conservation projects. Thank you for listening, and until next time.